Preaching is one of the most important ways in which these leaders who I interview get spiritual nourishment. I was struck, for example, one Fortune 100 CEO told me he listens to every single Tim Keller sermon, and that's part of his daily workout routine. That's also part of his spiritual edification. And I said to him, well, Tim preaches once a week, and you're working out, 5-6 days a week, so you've got to run out of material. He said, oh, I just listen to it over and over again. So there is a sense in which the preached word is vital to sort of the ways in which many of these leaders get their spiritual encouragement. It's also striking because this leader who I interviewed doesn't worship at Redeemer. He lives in a whole different time zone, but he gets spiritual nourishment there. What I find is that many of these folks are drawn to excellence, and so if they can find excellence in the pulpit, they will take advantage of it even if they're not actually worshiping in that community on a weekly basis. Another leader in government told me that his home church was this particular church in St. Louis. And I said, David, I don't remember from your bio you're ever living in St. Louis. And he said, oh, I haven't. I've been in Washington for 20 years. I've never been part of, that. And I said, well, how could you call this particular church your home church? And he said, well, I log on and am part of the worship services at 8 o'clock every Sunday morning. And he said about 4 times a year I fly out there and I meet with the pastor, and that's sort of, he said, I feel part of that spiritual community. Now, he probably doesn't know 50 people at that church, and yet he feels some kind of spiritual kinship with that church, so much so that he calls that his home church, not the church he's worshiping in every Sunday morning in Washington. What that says to me is that spiritual community looks different than just merely showing up on Sunday morning, but it actually is a sense of loyalty, a sense of commitment, a sense of deep connection, particularly that comes with the pastor and through preaching. Well, I'd like to say that this outstanding preaching, transforms their lives on a weekly basis, and that they make different decisions than they would have made if they hadn't heard that sermon this past Sunday. I don't know that that's always the case. I don't know that they, in fact, I'm pretty confident it's not. That it's not like it's transforming them every single week to make a different decision. And yet, as I interviewed them, these leaders can point to particular sermons, particular messages that really spoke to them and moved them in significant ways. I remember a poignant interview. I interviewed the CEO of Saab USA, lived in Atlanta, and he was able to talk about a particular sermon that Andy Stanley preached on called Choosing to Cheat. And it was a message about how while we may not cheat on our spouse in sort of a, having an affair, we cheat in terms of time, or we cheat at work. There's no way we can do everything, and so we have to cut corners one way or another. And the question is, are the places where you're cutting corners, is that in line with what you profess to be your deep personal values of how you live your life? This guy could remember that sermon years after it was preached, so much so it brought him to tears, talking about how it caused him to sort of reassess his life. So great sermons actually become signal moments, spiritual milestones even in the journeys of a lot of these leaders. And because they lead such busy lives, because they have so many things competing for their attention, the fact that they are listening for 25 to 30 minutes, which for some of them, that's the longest amount of time they're actually listening to something without an interruption in their entire week. It's a real unique opportunity for the pastor to speak into their life in a very meaningful way, which in all honesty, as I heard that message, it made me take sort of more seriously the task of what I was doing whenever I was invited to fill into a pulpit or to preach, because it's a real rare opportunity in our world where people actually do listen for 25 minutes uninterrupted. Last night I was watching the premiere of Piers Morgan. He's the guy taking Larry King's job at CNN. And I realized, here's an interview he got. His first interview was with Oprah. And here's a time where he's wanting to sort of compress her whole life. But if you string all of that time together, take out the commercials, take out all the filler, you're still talking about 30 minutes of material. Preachers get to give that kind of content every single week. It's a real privilege and a real opportunity. But it's one, my hunch is that in the busyness of being a pastor, in all the different roles and responsibilities that they have to carry on a weekly basis, it's hard to remember just how vital that particular work really is to what the pastor does.